why do you think a second stimulus would work? I mean, many critics say most of it has been spent, it hasn't worked, it wasn't targeted, it wasn't long-term. So why will it work?
The first stimulus actually did work. Where they made a mistake was they thought, the administration thought, that the unemployment rate was going to peak at around 10% and that the stimulus would bring it down to 8%. Their mistake was the problems were much more severe than they thought. A little bit, my own estimates were much closer to the target. So if we hadn't had the stimulus, rather than the unemployment peaking at 10%, it would have been somewhere between 12 and 13%. Now, I'm very critical that stimulus was not big enough and it wasn't well enough designed. I mentioned before that about 40% of it went to a tax cut, and we knew that that was not going to give you very much bang for the buck. So what we needed was a more targeted tax stimulus. And what I've been arguing for now is a stimulus that's focused on investments in education, technology, infrastructure that will provide the basis of long-term economic growth.
Talk about that. Will you pushing forward? Because when we've spoken before, you talked about the internet and how the internet wouldn't have been here without a government stimulus of sorts. I mean, you say, look, we do have to focus on investments in infrastructure and roads and bridges in this country, but how does one target the stimulus or a second stimulus if we see one more than the first stimulus was?
The history of government investments in technology is actually very positive. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we did a study looking at a long history of government's investments in technology, and the average returns were extraordinarily high, over 50%. The internet, most of the advances in biotech are all related to basic research and applied research that the government has financed. So what I'm asking for is let's spend a little bit more on that, create the platform that will really transform America's economy for the next 25 years.
But does that create jobs in the near term?
Well, yes, it does, because right now one of the things that is a real concern is that we're laying off people in the universities where we don't have enough money for research. Now, this is just one component, but we also need to invest in infrastructure and in education. A broad-scale program creates jobs in the first round, but then, of course, those people buy goods and services, and that stimulates the economy in the second round. So you have to look not just at the first round benefits, but the second and third and fourth round.
What are the long-term impacts of what you call this waste of human capital because of long-term unemployment in this country? What are those significant impacts 1, 2, 5 years down the road?
The consequence is that if you have a long period of high unemployment, 8, 9, 10% for an extended period of time, and ours has already been high for a too long a period, then it becomes increasingly difficult to get it down. And when these guys get reemployed, it will typically be at a much lower wage simply because their skills have deteriorated.
Is that where we're headed?
That's where we're headed unless we have a second round of stimulus. Even with a second round of stimulus, things don't look good, but they'll work even worse if we don't have that second round of stimulus.